Hello, and welcome to the Book Tapestry. Have you ever considered what it would look like to walk into an operating theater where the surgeon isn't looking for a tumor, a broken bone, or a failing organ? What if instead, they were looking for your very capacity to say no? I'm Sophia Wordsmith, and this is episode 9. Today, we're going to talk about the terrifying precision of a world where your will is the only thing on the slab. In the world of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, the scalpel isn't made of cold steel, it's chemical, biological, and deeply social. We often talk about this classic text as a simple, hedonistic bargain, a story about a society that traded its collective soul for a steady supply of sex, drugs, and stability. But that's just the surface-level rot. The real horror, the radical horror, is something I call the existential lobotomy. Huxley didn't just imagine a world where people chose comfort over liberty, he envisioned a civilization that successfully treated freedom itself as a biological pathology, a disease to be managed, and eventually cured. This flies directly in the face of everything we know about existentialism, specifically the bedrock laid by Jean-Paul Sartre. For Sartre, freedom isn't a gift or a political right. It's an inescapable ontological fact. He famously said we are condemned to be free. Even when we try to hide from that freedom, what he calls bad faith, we are still making a choice. But what if a state found a way to neutralize that freedom without actually destroying it? What if they created a version of humanity that remains awake but is completely, terrifyingly frictionless? Today, we're diving into a world where the nausea of selfhood and the impulse toward revolt have been surgically removed from the human experience. We're looking at the scripted rebel, the universal look, and the authentic tyrant, to see if freedom can actually survive once it's been clinically managed and cured. To truly grasp the magnitude of the existential lobotomy, we have to look past the gadgets and the neon lights of the world state, and look at how they attack the very structure of human consciousness. In Sartrean terms, a human being is defined as a for itself. This means our consciousness is not a solid, finished object like a rock or a table. Instead, it is a nothingness, a gap, that is always unfinished and perpetually divided from itself. This internal distance is the most sacred and terrifying part of being human because it is exactly where freedom lives. It is the space between who you are and who you might become. However, that space is also the source of what Sartre calls nausea, that dizzying, stomach-turning realization that there is no pre-written script for your life. You are the sole author of your meaning, and that weight is heavy. It produces a tremor of shame or an impulse toward revolt when the world tries to define you. In the nightmare of Brave New World, the state doesn't just suppress this nausea. They use biological engineering and pharmacological sealing to close the gap entirely. They've essentially performed a metaphysical surgery. By conditioning the citizenry from the moment of conception and supplementing their daily lives with the chemical buffer of soma, the state ensures that the internal distance never opens up. The for itself is effectively flattened into an in itself, a solid, predictable object. They haven't necessarily killed the ability to process information or perform tasks, but they have made the emotional and spiritual cost of independent thought impossibly high. Or, perhaps more accurately, they have made the lack of thinking so incredibly frictionless that the for itself essentially goes dormant from disuse. It is a world where consciousness survives as a biological function, but it no longer has to grapple with its own unfinished nature. The vertigo of freedom is replaced by the horizontal stability of the hive mind, creating a human being who is cured of the very thing that makes them human. The second half of this deep analysis brings us to a concept Sartre explored in his play No Exit, The Look. In a healthy, albeit agonizing human existence, our sense of self is solidified when we are seen by another person, the other. When someone looks at you, you realize you are an object in their world, just as they are a subject in yours. This interaction is naturally filled with conflict and shame because the other's freedom threatens to define you. They see a version of you that you cannot see yourself. However, the world state's social architecture is meticulously designed to dissolve the other into background noise. They have achieved the impossible, a society with no other because there are no true subjects. Through the lens of sexual saturation and the mandatory everyone belongs to everyone else mantra, the individual is never truly seen as a unique, terrifyingly free subject. Instead, Other people become mere tools for pleasure, biological functions, or interchangeable parts of the social machine. You don't look at a person and see a soul, you see a utility. By eliminating this fundamental tension between the self and the other, the world state kills the self at the very point where it would otherwise coagulate. If no one ever looks at you with the gaze of a free being who can judge you, do you even truly exist as a person? In this cured world, there is no exit, because there is no one else to hold up a mirror to your own existential dread. In Sartre play, hell was other people because they forced you to face your own freedom and your own failures. In the world state, they've removed the hell, but in doing so, they've removed the humanity. You are surrounded by bodies, yet you are fundamentally alone in a vacuum of scripted, frictionless interactions. You are never judged, never challenged, and never truly encountered. The world state has replaced the agonizing, defining look of the other with the blank, pleasant stare of 1,000 identical faces. It is the ultimate social lobotomy, a world where we are all together, yet no one is actually there. When we search for a hero or a beacon of hope in this sterile, cured landscape, we inevitably land on John the Savage. On the surface, he is the perfect antithesis of the world state. He feels, he bleeds, and he quotes Shakespeare with the fervor of a religious zealot. But if we look closer through a Sartrean lens, a much darker reality emerges. John is what I call the ultimate scripted rebel. John attempts to resist the system by clinging to the rituals of the reservation and the archaic verse of the bard. But here's the existential catch: he isn't actually choosing freedom. Instead, he is merely trading one pre-written script for another. Where the citizens of London are conditioned by hypnopedic rhymes and the chemical haze of Soma, John is conditioned by an inherited, romanticized ideology of suffering and flagellation. He doesn't invent his own values, he simply adopts a different set of ready-made ones found in a book or an old tradition. Because he cannot conceive of a world outside of these two rigid extremes, the mindless, numbing pleasure of the world state or the performative, ritualized agony of his upbringing, he collapses under the weight of his own bad faith. In existentialist thought, bad faith is the act of lying to oneself, of pretending that you are a finished object defined by your circumstances, rather than a free agent capable of radical novelty. John insists on his right to be unhappy, but he doesn't know how to exist without a script to tell him why he's unhappy or how he should feel that pain. His rebellion is loud, visceral, and tragic, but it is ultimately unauthentic because it is a reactionary performance. When he finally realizes that he cannot escape being seen as a mere curiosity, a savage on display for the world state's amusement, his inability to create a third, unscripted path leads to his self-destruction. John's failure is a haunting warning for us. Resistance is not the same thing as authenticity. If your rebellion is just a remix of someone else's ideas, or a performance for an audience of voyeurs, you haven't escaped the lobotomy. You've just changed the brand of the anesthesia that keeps you from truly waking up to your own freedom. Finally, we have to confront the most complex and perhaps most terrifying figure in this entire social experiment, Mustafa Mond, the world controller. I call him the authentic tyrant. Unlike the alphas, betas, and gammas who wander through their lives in a blissful, soma-induced fog, Mond is a truly lucid soul. He is one of the few individuals permitted to possess forbidden knowledge, the works of Shakespeare, the Bible, and the history of science. He understands exactly what has been sacrificed to maintain the stability of the world state. He knows that high art requires passion, that science requires doubt, and that religion requires a sense of the infinite, all things that have been systematically purged from his society. In a terrifying twist on existentialist thought, Mond has effectively monopolized the world's supply of anguish. He keeps freedom and authenticity for himself, stored away like priceless museum artifacts or kept in literal exile on the islands where the misfits live. He is the only person in the world state who truly chooses his life, making him the only subject in a universe of objects. This dynamic is a radical violation of Sartre's core ethical demand, the idea that one cannot truly will oneself free without also willing the freedom of others. In the Sartrean universe, authenticity is meant to be a shared human project, but Mond proves that authenticity can be made parasitic. He enjoys the intellectual thrill of knowing the truth and the weight of making real choices, while intentionally denying that truth to billions of others for the sake of a higher good called comfort. His tyranny is not hypocritical, it is something far more dangerous. It is self-aware. He argues that he is a servant of happiness, a man who has sacrificed his own right to be purely happy to manage the machinery of the state. But in reality, he is a hoarder of the human spirit. He shows us that a society doesn't actually need to eliminate freedom to defeat it. It just needs to design itself so efficiently that freedom no longer matters to anyone but the man at the top. Mond is the ultimate curator of the existential lobotomy, the man who keeps his own mind sharp and his soul unfinished specifically so he can ensure no one else's ever is. He lives in the no exit of his own making, a solitary subject ruling over a graveyard of content, unthinking things. Ultimately, our deep dive into Brave New World exposes a profound and terrifying blind spot in the classical existentialist tradition. Jean-Paul Sartre may be absolutely correct in a metaphysical sense, that freedom is an inescapable ontological truth, and that we are, by the very nature of our consciousness, condemned to be free. But what Aldous Huxley demonstrates with such chilling precision is that even a metaphysical truth can be rendered phenomenologically irrelevant. In other words, if you can't feel your freedom, if you have no language to describe it, and if your biology has been edited to ensure you never desire it, does that freedom even exist in any meaningful way? The haunting question the novel leaves us with is no longer the old-fashioned debate of whether we are free or determined. Instead, the question is whether freedom, as a lived, felt experience, can actually survive once it has been fully decoded, clinically managed, and finally cured like a common infection. We are moving toward a world where the friction of choice is being smoothed over by algorithms, chemistry, and social engineering. If we eventually succeed in designing a society where the word no is no longer a biological or psychological possibility, then the existential lobotomy I've described today will be complete. It won't look like a prison, it will look like a playground. It won't feel like a tragedy, it will feel like a long, warm afternoon. And that is the true horror. It is a silence much louder and more permanent than any scream of rebellion could ever be. It is the silence of a species that has finally found happiness by cutting out its own heart. I'm Sophia Wordsmith, and this has been episode 9. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the hatchery. We'll see you next time as we continue to peel back the layers of the scripts we live by. Until then, stay awake, stay unfinished, and keep questioning the comfort. Thank you for listening to The Book Tapestry. If you found this helpful, please share it with a friend who prefers listening over reading. See you next time.